Somewhere in the frozen wilderness of prehistoric Siberia, a small group of hunters made a decision. They pushed further than anyone before them had ever gone. They crossed a threshold, and in doing so, they accidentally split the human story in two. One world became two worlds that would grow, thrive, and evolve in complete isolation. Millions of people on each side, each convinced that their horizon was the edge of everything. They were both wrong. And the moment those two worlds finally collided, nothing, for either of them, would ever be the same again. 5 times in the documented history of this planet, Earth has plunged into catastrophic deep freezes, ice ages so severe they reshaped coastlines, consumed entire seas, and forced every living species to either adapt or disappear forever. The most recent one lasted for millennia, and for the humans enduring it, there was no shelter beyond stone and fire, no food beyond what the frozen land reluctantly gave up. Every single day was a negotiation with extinction. Right in the heart of this glacial darkness, roughly 20 to 25,000 years ago, a hunting party in what we now call Siberia was doing what survival demanded, tracking prey, moving through the cold, pushing further than they had gone before. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have known, was that the terrain beneath their boots was not solid, permanent land. It was a bridge, a temporary one, and it was already disappearing. Because of the extreme global freeze, ocean levels had dropped so dramatically that a narrow corridor of land had risen up from the seafloor, connecting what we now call Siberia to Alaska. It looked like just another stretch of frozen wilderness, unremarkable, cold, empty. To those hunters, it was simply the path forward. They followed it, and without fanfare, without ceremony, without any comprehension of what they had just done, they walked out of the old world and into a new one. 11,000 years later, the Ice Age ended. Temperatures rose, the oceans reclaimed what they had surrendered. And that land bridge, the one these hunters had crossed without a second thought, sank silently beneath the waves. Forever. The corridor between two worlds closed, and the people on each side were now strangers, with no way of knowing the other even existed. That submerged corridor is what we call the Bering Strait today. At its narrowest point, the gap between the old world and the new is just 53 miles. 53 miles. And yet, it would take another 10,500 years before any human being crossed it again. Why? What kept two entire civilizations from finding each other for so long? That answer is stranger than you might expect. Those original hunters didn't stay put. Over thousands of years, their descendants multiplied and spread, building civilizations, establishing empires, and mapping out a world they were absolutely certain was entirely their own. And what a world it was. In what is now Mexico, the Aztec Empire dominated, a sophisticated, brutal, breathtaking superpower covering over 77,000 square miles, built from roughly 500 distinct states and home to 6 million people. To their south, the Maya civilization had been flourishing for 4,000 years, producing achievements in astronomy, architecture, and mathematics that would have astonished any observer from any corner of the earth. And further south still, stretching from Ecuador all the way down through Chile and Argentina, the Inca Empire commanded 12 million subjects across a political and engineering structure so advanced that modern historians still struggle to fully explain it. These were not primitive peoples scratching at the soil. These were civilizations. Beyond the three great empires, the entire continent breathed with life. The Arawak people had settled the Caribbean. Native American nations claimed territories from the boreal forests of Canada to the southern tip of Patagonia. Millions of people, farming, trading, praying, grieving, celebrating, building, living full and complex and irreplaceable lives. And across the ocean, on the other side of a world neither half knew was shared, around 5 million people doing the same. Two populations, one planet, zero awareness that the other existed, not in legend, not in scripture, not on a single map anywhere in the known world. Each side looked out at the horizon and saw the same thing: the end. But there were whispers. There are always whispers. Chinese poetry, written over 1,700 years ago, described a mysterious distant land called Fusang, a place so far east it lay beyond the Eastern Sea, and beyond that, another ocean, vast and seemingly endless. The geography lines up with the Americas with an unsettling precision. In the year 458, an Afghan Buddhist monk named Hui Shen and 4 companions set out east from China. They were gone for 40 years. When Hui Shen returned, he brought back a detailed written account of a foreign land, its people, its landscape, its customs, that he also called Fusang. Scholars have spent centuries arguing over whether he was describing the Pacific coast of North America. 5 centuries after that, Norse Vikings established a physical settlement in Newfoundland, in what is now Canada. The ruins survive to this day. Archaeologists have confirmed the dates. The Vikings were there. And then they left, and told no one. Various traditions carry similar claims. Muslim sailors said to have crossed the Atlantic during the reign of Caliph Abdul Rahman III. Hindu seafarers, whose influence, some scholars argue, can be traced in the religious iconography of certain Native American tribes. The evidence is tantalizing and incomplete. Here is what is not contested. None of it changed anything. Not the monks, not the Vikings, not the sailors, because none of them understood what they had found. None of them returned home and said, "There is another world beyond the horizon, vast, inhabited, real." None of them bridged the gap in a way that held. The two worlds remained strangers, and they might have stayed that way indefinitely. But then the 15th century arrived, and it didn't just change the equation, it detonated it. To truly understand how the Americas were finally found and why it happened when it did, you need to understand what Europe was going through. Because this story does not begin with discovery. It begins with collapse. For centuries, the Roman Empire had been the uncontested center of the Western world, a superpower stretching from the British Isles to the edges of Mesopotamia. Rome was not merely a military force, it was a civilizational identity. The idea that order, Christianity, and human progress were all moving in the same direction. Forward, outward, Roman. But empires are not immortal. By the 15th century, that vast world had contracted, shrunk and battered by centuries of war, plague, and internal fracture, down to a single city, Constantinople. And then, on a May morning in 1453, the walls came down. The last living heartbeat of Rome. Built by Constantine, the first Christian emperor, Constantinople was sacred in a way that went beyond politics. It housed the Hagia Sophia, one of the most magnificent structures human hands had ever produced, and served as the spiritual capital of Orthodox Christianity for millions across the continent. To attack Constantinople was not merely to attack a city, it was to attack the soul of a civilization. It was also the most important economic artery in the world. Every luxury that Asia produced, Chinese silk, Indian spices, Persian jewels, Central Asian gold, flowed through Constantinople before reaching European markets. The entire economic metabolism of the continent depended on this one city remaining open. Sultan Mehmed II, 21 years old, relentless, and brilliant, led the Ottoman forces that ended what remained of the Roman Empire in a single siege. The Byzantine emperor died in the fighting. The city was renamed Istanbul, and the last ember of Rome was extinguished. Europe did not just mourn. Europe panicked. The economic consequences were immediate and savage. With the Ottomans now controlling the primary land routes to Asia, European trade was not merely disrupted, it was amputated. The flow of goods that had sustained entire economies for generations simply stopped. Unemployment exploded across the continent. Poverty spread through city streets with the same indifference as plague. Families who had never known hunger were suddenly unable to feed their children. The suffering recorded in contemporary accounts is almost unbearable to read. People walked the streets of European cities with their eyes fixed upward, not in prayer, but in fear, because criminals had taken to the rooftops, dropping heavy stones onto passers-by before descending to rob and strip the bodies. The wealthy hired armed escorts. Everyone else navigated a world that had, in the span of a single generation, become unrecognizable. But the wound went deeper than economics. For devout Christians across Europe, the fall of Constantinople carried an almost apocalyptic weight. Islamic empires had been steadily reclaiming territories that Christians had held for centuries. Spain was still locked in its own desperate campaign to drive Muslim forces from its southern cities. The fear, raw, sincere, and continent-wide, was that Christianity itself was being slowly erased from the map. This was not paranoia. This was the felt experience of an entire generation, watching their world shrink. Europe needed more than a trade route. It needed a miracle. The only land route to Asia ran east, directly through Ottoman-controlled territory. The Mediterranean alternative ran south, through Egypt and North Africa, where powerful Islamic states controlled the coast and raided European ships without hesitation. One Portuguese explorer, Bartolomeu Dias, had found a path around the southern tip of Africa, but the voyage took months each way and bled money at every turn. It was not a solution. It was a desperate detour. Every door was closed. Every route was blocked. And then, right at the moment of maximum desperation, when Europe had run out of options and very nearly run out of hope, an unknown Italian sailor stepped forward with an idea that everyone who heard it thought was either brilliant or completely mad. He said there was a shortcut. Sail west, straight west, across the open Atlantic. No rivals, no blockades, no detours. Reach Japan in under 3,000 miles, and from there, all of Asia opens up. His name was Christopher Columbus. Columbus had grown up on the sea, born in Genoa, Italy, a city that built sailors the way other cities built soldiers. He was educated, ambitious, and thoroughly obsessed with a century-and-a-half-old travel account that, in the desperate climate of 15th century Europe, had taken on the weight of scripture. Marco Polo's descriptions of Asia had become the mythology of a starving continent. Polo's Japan, which he called Sipangu, had rooftops sheathed in solid gold. His China was a civilization so vast and so wealthy, it made the greatest European kingdoms look like provincial outposts. To a continent that had just lost everything, these stories were not entertainment. They were the promise of salvation. Columbus believed he could reach them, and he believed something else, something that ran deeper than ambition. He called himself the Christ-bearer. Drawn from the legend of Saint Christopher, who was said to have carried the Christ child across a raging river, Columbus had constructed a private theology around his own destiny. He was not merely a sailor seeking profit. He was, in his own mind, an instrument of God. His voyage would not just find gold, it would carry Christianity across the ocean, plant it in new soil, and build an empire that would restore everything Rome had lost. Gold and God, two of the most powerful forces in human history, and Columbus had convinced himself he was the vessel for both. He spent years trying to convince everyone else. Italy passed, Portugal passed, England passed. Court after court heard his proposal and turned him away. Some politely, some not. He was dismissed as a dreamer with flawed mathematics and too much certainty. In 1485, he arrived in Spain. King Ferdinand II and Queen Isabella were the dominant monarchs of the Iberian Peninsula, locked in their final campaign to reclaim Granada, the last Muslim stronghold on Spanish soil. Columbus lingered in the orbit of their court for 7 extraordinary years, petitioning, waiting, being passed over. 7 years. 7 years of his life poured into one unwavering conviction that he was right and everyone else was wrong. Then, in 1491, with Granada finally on the verge of surrender, Queen Isabella called him in. Columbus stood before the Spanish crown and delivered the performance of his life. He promised wealth that would transform Spain overnight, the gold of Japan, the silk routes of China, the spice trade of the entire East. He promised the spiritual reward of bringing Christianity to populations no missionary had ever reached. He promised that Spain would not merely recover from its losses, it would surpass every nation on earth. Queen Isabella said yes. Columbus had his ships. He had his moment. And he had a secret he was keeping from absolutely everyone. Here is what Queen Isabella did not know. Columbus had lied to her. Not about everything, but about the one thing that mattered most. His calculations of the distance were catastrophically wrong. The voyage he had promised would take weeks would, in reality, push his crew to the absolute edge of human endurance. And somewhere out in the middle of that featureless, merciless ocean, with no land in any direction, supplies running dangerously low, and no way back, his men would figure it out. And they would come for him. What exactly had Columbus hidden from the Queen, from his crew, from everyone? What did he do when the mutiny began forming in the dark below decks? And when his ships finally made landfall, not in Japan, not in China, but somewhere that appeared on no map, in no book, in no dream any European had ever had? What happened in that first irreversible moment of contact? That is where episode 2 begins. 25,000 years of separation, 2 worlds built in complete isolation, each one convinced it was alone, and one man, flawed, driven, and not entirely honest, who was about to end that silence forever. If you want to know what happened next, episode 2 is waiting. Subscribe so you don't miss it.